Good morning. It is May 14th, 2024, 9:04 a.m. Roll call. Brent Woods,
Here.
Rick Wright,
Here.
Dennis Kuhn,
Here.
Fred Knapp,
Here.
Jeff Hamstra,
Here.
Ken Cawthorn,
Here.
Thomas Hayes.
Here.
All members are present. We have quorum.
I didn't keep all these.
Dennis. Yes. Can we do a quick round of the room?
Dan Ice, Beaver County Building.
Andrew Reese, City of Tucson Planning and Development.
Clayton Trevelyan, City of Tucson, Planning and Development.
Rick Hollander, International, IEI, Independent.
Morning, Ben Garcia on behalf of the Southern Arizona Homebuilders Association and the Arizona Multi Housing Association.
Gobby's, Ford Companies. Mark Massick, City of Tucson.
Kevin Quinlan, MEP.
Thomas Hayes, on behalf of Southern Arizona Business Association.
Thank you all for being with us today.
Okay, item 2, International Mechanical Code. Who wants to start? Ken?
I guess I'll start, yes. So where we left off last month was trying to figure out, I think primarily there was a couple of things. One was, go to the easier one. This first. Dan, I thought you were gonna try to contact somebody with, that Oregon. Yeah, I'm sorry, and I didn't follow up with that either. And that's in regards to the odor control for, marijuana facilities. Because I had provided some language for that, and basically I had copied it from one of the jurisdictions that had given some pretty explicit requirements, which at least it gives the AHJs some direction rather than just saying provide odor control and walk away. And so it provided some room pressure control and odor control requirements. So I think that was it is pretty lengthy, I think, but it at least provides some clear direction. So I'm hoping that we could get that resolved.
You're proposing to put that in the
Yeah,
code?
yeah, yes. And so, I think the only other outstanding issue is this whole refrigerant issue, which is still plodding forward with manufacturers and the EPA. And I guess my big concern is if you got 3-story building or more, how we can deal with that. Because according to both ASHRAE 15 and Chapter 11 of the IMC, they say when you change refrigerant use, you need to bring it up to current code, which then the biggest issue of that is there's a shaft requirement. If you penetrate more than one floor, you now have to route the refrigerant piping in a ventilated shaft. And I mean, my initial thought is we should limit that requirement to larger systems, so that we don't get hit with 5-ton systems and less being in all these, any building 3 stories or more, especially apartment buildings are going to be devastated. I don't know how they're going to deal with it.
Well, isn't this an issue between new construction versus existing construction?
Correct. That's what I'm saying is if you have an existing building and you change refrigerant and now you go to replace that unit breaks down on January 1st of this year, the only system that they can get is an A2L refrigerant, which is slightly flammable refrigerant, which now throws you into, since you're changing the refrigerant classification, it throws you into, it has to be installed per current code. Which then would say you'd have to put that in either a ventilated shaft or down the exterior wall in a, you could have it in an enclosure, but it'd have to be ventilated to the outside. Any way they do it, it's gonna be a huge expense on so many buildings that are 3 stories and more. If it's 2-story building, it's no big deal. They just change the unit out. 3 stories and more is where it gets complex and very expensive for somebody to change that unit out. And I think that's where we need to address that. And ASHRAE hasn't addressed it, neither has the IMC. It is being addressed in other countries, in Asia and in Europe, it's being addressed, but they don't have the requirements that our codes and ASHRAE have either. So that's where my initial thought is we've limited based on the volume of refrigerant. Right now, there is a limitation if it's under, 6.6 pounds for residential and under 22 pounds of refrigerant for commercial. It doesn't have to comply with all these standards, but that doesn't apply to the shaft requirement. And I'm saying, why don't we have that also applied to the shaft requirement? And even increase, and that 6.6 pounds gets a little bit tricky on apartments. And I'm thinking of, some of these apartment buildings like just down the street here that are, 6 floors, 5 floors, or to the north of us, that are 5 or 6 floors, you're gonna exceed that 6.6 pounds pretty quickly. And so
usually about 3 stories and up is when you're starting to break that threshold of more than 6 pounds.
yeah, so it works out to be about, typically around 2 pounds per ton. So 6.6 is usually gets you in that 3 tons, but you're gonna start breaking that 3-ton barrier on a higher, because of your refrigerant line lengths and the amount of refrigerant needed to fill those. So my initial thought is we increase that, we either increase that requirement on existing, let's say existing buildings can have maybe up to 10 pounds or something like that of refrigerant without having to comply for the with the ventilated shafts. So that was my initial thought. Before I write something up, I was trying to get something on what they're doing in Europe and what they're doing in Asia. I think Asia, they don't have these requirements that we have here, but I know Japan does. So some of the areas in Asia do. But I know Europeans are using A2Ls and have been using them for a few decades now, and I just don't know how they're getting by without it. So that's kind of where it's going. And it's all this is new because A2Ls haven't been used, are not being used currently in the US. And they're going to be used as of January, all manufacturers. So. Yeah. Canada it pretty much follows the same kind of requirements we sort of do. So, and they've been using, I don't know if they've been using A2Ls for the most part. I think their refrigerants have been A1 refrigerants, the same as we've been using. So, I don't know.
This is Clayton with the City of Tucson. I recently attended the committee action hearings in Florida for the 27 code cycle and had a great opportunity to be exposed to a number of folks that were instrumental in the writing of these codes. And so I spent a good deal of time trying to get as much backstory as possible. And I will tell you that the dialogue, although anecdotal at the moment, because I don't have testing criteria and documents to provide, I'm still working on some of those references. The conversation with those individuals is that the testing performed for line sets under a fire condition demonstrated that they leaked time and time again when exposed to higher temperatures, which is not surprisable or surprising based on brazing techniques. The average home fire temperature exceeds 1100 degrees, which is where the brazing temperature is at. So the primary concern for the majority of the folks and professionals that I talked to at the code hearing said that they were primarily concerned about the line sets leaking under high temperature situations. And so when you have a even mildly flammable refrigerant inside of tubing or piping that has a propensity to leak when it gets extremely hot, was the primary concern there. In previous meetings, we've also talked about natural gas supply and the unlimited amount, but they don't experience the same leaking scenarios with black iron pipe that's threaded. And so what we're talking about is mechanical rust joints and brazing. And so one proposal that I've heard was related to not allowing joints in refrigerant piping inside concealed walls as an alternative. That's something the city would entertain as an appeal, or potentially even an amendment if we have additional supporting documentation. The concern is expressly about the joints, but I have heard, I haven't seen the actual test results, but I've heard that ASHRAE did some extensive testing, and that is where the criteria actually came from, because of the potential for the mildly flammable refrigerant to further fuel the fire under a fire condition. And also, we talked quite a bit about the double wall refrigerant piping that is specified in the 24 code. And that was actually a strategic movement by the ICC to motivate the industry to create something, because it doesn't exist now. But again, the discussions with the manufacturers at the time that the code was being written is there would be no incentive for the manufacturers to invest in research and development to create a double wall piping system if they don't know for sure that it would be acceptable. So the ICC took that extra step and said, okay, we'll put it in the code now, even though it doesn't exist, to help motivate manufacturers to create additional products that may be available, because they were pretty firm about not allowing an unprotected line set that potentially could leak in a fire.
So my concern is existing buildings. I tend to have no issues, because we can address new buildings and could provide the shafts, we could, and ventilate them and everything for new buildings a lot easier than an existing building. Like I said, is any of these buildings in this vicinity here.
And the possibility of joints is quite high.
Correct, right. And so now, comes January 1st, their unit goes down and they have to replace it, and their only option is to go to an A2L. I doubt that they're gonna get a permit to replace it, because they would then have to then go through number of floors and create this shaft and to encase that refrigerant, that refrigerant piping, and then ventilate all that. And that's my concern, is that we're gonna go down, we're gonna give something to existing buildings that's almost impossible for them to comply with.
Hey, this is Clayton again. I don't entirely agree with that. I appreciate the concern, but the code also specifically identified the alternative to provide a new line set on the exterior of the building. And so when we're talking about existing buildings, when you see retrofits or new systems having external conduit or external piping, is not altogether that uncommon. And that's why the external application was actually written into the code to address that scenario where you can't get into an existing building and create a fire rated shaft inside the building without completely tearing it apart.
I asked one question, I have a question for you to add on to your, what you're gonna have.
Okay, the question I have is this, is if the building's being retrofitted or new construction, and Kim can write a specific set of requirements that there is no joints, and the only joints are at the apparatuses, would that be something that, you know, that's kind of vague in here? Would that be something that, you know, we could see signed off on?
Absolutely, that's exactly what
Okay.
I'm pursuing at the moment.
And my question to you was, how realistic is that in an existing
Well, I mean,
apartment building?
you're gonna have to identify where they run.
Right. You get,
Remove drywall, which isn't a major,
right, run a new line.
and you could run a new line where it's currently located, but do it continuously.
Right.
If it's over 50 feet, there are ways you can buy full rolls of refrigerant.
Right.
We've done that
Right.
as well, that you can buy 500-foot rolls and what have you. And so it is possible
Good.
to do that in that kind of situation. I just would want to make sure we're all, that we would get a sign off on that there's only a raise at each apparatus.
So that's something as we move forward with the testing that's going on, that if that's something we can confirm, that's the only concern is the raised joints. I mean, I would love to see that exception put in, the, you know, our amendments.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And so, just as, kind of a little bit of a backstory there. I've been searching for the reason behind why the shaft became a requirement. So far, the only answer that I've gotten from the industry is the joints. If I can confirm that that's the only reason why the shaft is, is
Yeah.
required.
Then you avoid the shaft. We don't, you know, we avoid ventilation. You know, we don't even have a ventilation standard for it.
Right.
I mean,
And
so
so
what do you ventilate it at? What rate?
Well, they do give
Oh,
that
do they?
requirement, yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
didn't, I
So
passed that over.
again, but, so all of these are good solutions, I agree, it's just the 3-story more apartment or office building, whatever it might be, a simple unit replacement is expensive enough. Now you double to triple that cost with having to either replace line sets, reroute line sets.
Because if it's dependent on the bottom floor, you're gonna have to,
Right.
you
And you
know,
have, you know, potentially,
people above that you're gonna have to get in and open up
Right.
walls.
and potentially, you know, 5 or 6 floors, right? So it's, that's my concern. And some of these are, you know, glass buildings and whatnot. How do we, you know, there's a lot of those kinds of questions that I don't know how to answer those without it costs. Yeah, it can be solved and there, you could definitely provide that shaft or provide a continuous refrigerant pipe, but it's gonna, that unit replacement cost has just gone up exponentially.
So
Yeah.
your concern is that the cost is.
On existing buildings,
It's gonna
on
drive
existing
people not to
buildings.
get permanent, not.
correct, because existing buildings, it's gonna be so cost prohibitive to replace that unit. I'm not concerned about the new buildings. The new buildings, we can do these extra things, and since it's new, you can build it into the building, right? And you can find ways to get it done without it being a great expense. On an existing building is, come January 1 is where I'm concerned about, where the only option they have is an A2L. Now they can go in, they can replace compressors, they can replace condenser coils, they can rebuild the unit, which is probably gonna be cheaper than putting in a new unit.
Yeah.
But it's just, now I guess it's a different market. Maybe that's the answer, is you're gonna just have a different market where we rebuild these existing units.
And this
So we can
process
use
is actually gonna fix sooner than January 1st. all indications I'm getting from distributors is, and every time we go through this change, we end up with this period of time where we almost don't have units. Because the manufacturer wants to run out of the old units and make sure they have none left on their shelf. And then it's like, okay, when are we phasing in making the new ones? So I actually have a strategy. I'm gonna buy a whole bunch of units. Because I've been through it before.
Right.
And literally, we go through a period where you cannot get a unit for 6 or 8 weeks. Just because you're in that lull because of what's going on. So this problem is gonna hit us quicker than we really realized. You know, January 1's the date, but it's coming soon.
So question, Ken, the threshold on refrigerant volume?
Yes.
Is that causing the kick in of the ventilated shaft?
No, no, the ventilated shaft is simply because of the type of refrigerant.
But
And that's where I'm saying, maybe we do allow a certain threshold of the amount of refrigerant to kick in to avoid the ventilated shaft. Right now, everything I read, the ventilated shaft is only required if you have these types of refrigerants. And you're penetrating more than a single floor. So maybe, and that's where, but there, because there's the refrigerant volume, you don't have to comply with refrigeration machinery room and all these other things that are in there, so long as the refrigerant volume is under these certain amounts, 6.6 pounds for residential occupancies and 22 pounds for commercial occupancies, which I think is a good idea. So I was just saying, hey, yeah, it's some refrigerant, but it's not of a volume great enough for us to throw in all these other life safety issues. And that's where I'm saying, can we apply that same kind of volume requirement to these shafts of penetrating more than one floor?
Ken, do you think that the poundage difference, because that's what they're worried about, you know, it's basically flaming, you know, really keeping the fire going and adding to it, is in a commercial application, they're allowing 20 pounds because there's typically fire protection, where apartments, a lot of times there's not.
Well, apartments do have the fire protection too. Yeah,
Not all of
so-
Not only-
Now, the older ones don't. Yeah, so maybe that's some of the issues is maybe, I don't know. I mean, you can see we're going down this dark hole, right?
Well,
And it is a rabbit hole, believe me.
This is Clayton again. I also want to provide a little bit of caution for us to assume that a certain volume of refrigerant would be considered negligible without some sort of test. Because we're talking about life safety, because we're talking about fire safety, the city of Tucson is going to lean towards the adopted regulation, right? Not exceed that unless we have some sort of data to support, support that theory. So if there can be, provided some information to suggest that, 20 pounds of A2L refrigerant would, be a negligible quantity of mildly flammable fuel in a fire condition, then, that's something that we could look at, but without again, additional information to say that, 20 pounds is, less hazardous than 30 pounds. But
Right.
we're really pulling numbers out of the air at that point.
Well, I mean, I have a question in the discussions. Well, I understand the concern isn't that these lines will be the cause of the fire, but they'll contribute to the fire. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, but the whole thrust of life safety is to get the people out of the building, not necessarily to save the building.
I might disagree with that also.
Well, it's gonna affect your insurance rates, but in terms of the code, I mean, we do fire sprinklers, we do smoke alarms to get people more time to get out of the burning building.
Agreed. And
That's the
give,
primary,
and give first responders time
right,
to respond. But also, when major catastrophes such as the Great Conflagration in San Francisco, it was the obliteration of an entire city, right? That motivated investors to say, if you can't provide building, a certain level of building safety, we're not going to rebuild.
Well,
So I would say that the codes are also twofold. One is life safety and the other is protection of property. There
yes,
is,
the protection part, property is more of a market driven requirement than a life safety requirement. The question
What you
is,
do with the life safety of the firefighters in the building
Mhm.
while that fire is occurring.
Right.
So there's a life safety component of it beyond just protecting property.
well, and it's all a trade-off.
Sure.
You can't make the building 100% safe.
Trade-off, but rely on our smarts and technology when it's a reasonable thing to do.
Which is why we have these debates.
Yeah, yeah, so I'm trying to reach out to some of these European standards to see what they're doing in their buildings, because they've had A2Ls for some time now. And how they're dealing with it in their existing buildings, and just seeing, kind of comparing that to what our current, and realize the good news is that ASHRAE 15 is a living document, so it is constantly changing, and it's been going through a lot of changes these last few years. And I think now, since the A2Ls are being this big push, we're gonna see a lot more changes. Unfortunately, the IMC is not a living document, so it just changes once every 3 years, and we got until 2027 for it to react. And I think they are waiting for ASHRAE to come up with something, is what I'm guessing, because it seems like they follow ASHRAE 15 pretty much per letter.
I would say that there's a strong reliance on the organization's cooperation together. There were multiple ASHRAE representatives at the ACC code hearings testifying for the IMC, and the committees were relying on the knowledge of the ASHRAE staff that were there. So I'd say that they do complement each other in that way.
All right, so I guess I think what needs to occur, is for just some more research, I think, to try to figure out how, my big push is existing buildings, how to deal with this so that it's not such a huge burden for somebody to change a unit. And it might be the burden is, you're not gonna change the unit, you're going to replace its guts. And you're gonna replace the compressor, you're gonna just rebuild the unit on site rather than replace it, because that way they can still use their A1 refrigerant and not have to change it to an A2L, which that's where it triggers all these other issues. And maybe that is the answer. I just don't know. So. Because they're still making compressors that are, and they're gonna continue to make compressors. There's no EPA saying you have to stop making these compressors for these other refrigerants. Those are still being built.
Yeah, what is the actual phase out of R410A length? I'm trying to remember the year.
I don't remember.
35.
Yeah, it's down, it's still a little bit out, so it's still gonna be around, and they're still gonna be able, again, they're just gonna have to rebuild all these parts. They can't order a unit that's already built, it's gonna have to be something that's field done, and so now there's gonna be a whole new industry, basically, of people rebuilding units, I think, for these buildings to avoid this shaft requirement. Which is what I'm saying is,
Yeah, because the rebuild is gonna be way
Way
far
more.
cheaper.
like, way less costly.
Move it.
Cost, right. It's not gonna be as inexpensive as buying the unit, but it's still gonna be cheaper than having to do all these upgrades to make the A2L, in the ventilated shafts. So, and it might be a building by building. If it's just a 3-story building, yeah, maybe it is easier just to run the line set down the exterior, put a wire mold or cover over it and call it good.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's from the engineer.
That's it. Robbie has a question.
Robbie is, Play 9, Ken has a very valid point about these retrofits. You really want to run that line set, point A to point B, as short as possible. The equipment works more efficiently, correct, Mr.
Yeah.
Hamstrom?
Yes.
So if there is a point where those line sets get too long, and you can't be used, so instead of going point to point, you gotta go out the roof, up the parapet, down the building, back to the unit. You could be doubling the length of the run for those line sets. So I believe in some retrofits. There could be some monkeying going on with those. Just something that, how do you prevent that? Ken's throwing out some ideas for that. And whenever you do your research and you're sending that Ken to Dan and the Clayton, is the rest, is this team getting CC'd or how's that getting shared? The reason being, I think you had I watched all the videos, I was here for the past ones. You had shared some exhibit of, I think it was line sets or something, I don't know what it was, a drawing. I didn't see that in the back.
that was the exhaust fans.
I just wanted to share that so everybody else is looking at it. But what's the plan going forward?
Well, I think what I could do is, yeah, I think what I could do is publish because everything's being published right on that
Yeah.
site. So what I could do is I could issue some documents or what I find. And we could have those published.
Attachments or something, then
Right.
if somebody has questions, we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Last point, a lot of CCNRs on buildings and projects will say no exposed piping on the exterior. So there's just one more hurdle. Clayton, bringing this CCNR to document though, that is prohibitive in regards to exposed junk on buildings.
And yeah, and like I said, and your point is that, you got these 5 and 6 story buildings that are already stretching the limits of the length of the refrigerant pipe. So now to run, those buildings may not have an option to go to the outside. So the ventilated shaft would be the only option. And that's where I guess I'm coming back with it. I don't know how to make that work without it being cost prohibitive.
Well, I think the point is, I'm concerned about the existing buildings, because if it gets too cost prohibitive, they won't get a permit, and they will potentially dangerous installation. So I think it's upon us to come up with some alternatives that are financially feasible. So they don't do stuff with them, great
Right.
situations.
I agree.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm afraid we lost focus on this thing. Because I think we're the only jurisdiction that has mid-rise buildings with an air conditioning problem coming on it. I think it'd be interesting to know what is happening in debates like these in other communities. Or are we just smarter than everybody else? And we figured it out. Everybody else is saying, oh, we're just going to.
You hit the nail on the head.
So I think, but almost all the hard arguments start out with, well, I don't really know, but.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, maybe we need to put brakes on it a little bit.
Yes.
If something happens industry-wide that comes up with a magic solution, and of everything I've heard right now, what Clayton brought up about the raised connections with the piping and eliminating them, maybe that does make it safe. One would think that industry would try to push for that kind of solution if it's really viable. We're gonna hear about it. Even if we adopt the code as it is, because we gotta keep moving forward, get these things adopted. Our committee still meets in the interim period, and we can issue an interim amendment as soon as we get some real information on it. But I'm just hearing all this speculation, and I'm thinking that it's not just Tucson and Pima County. It's the whole country that's got to deal with this thing.
Everybody's in the same boat.
If we deal with it ourselves, we might not deal with it the right way. And then, the thing about not getting a permit being unsafe, well, we don't want them to get a permit and it's unsafe either. It turns out it really is unsafe. I don't really know if it is or not, but I have heard that you need, 600 degrees to catch this refrigerant on fire, but it takes an 1100 degree fire to damage the piping. So it seems to me that the degrees are there for that, whatever combustibility is in the refrigerant to add fuel to the fire. Well, you know, you don't pour gasoline on the fire and put it out, so. I don't know, I just feel like we're trying to do something that we can't solve ourselves, and that maybe we should just agree that we recognize this is something that we need to pay close attention to. And anybody that's got influence to encourage the people on the national level to keep researching it and come up with a better solution, I think that'd be the best thing we should do for that.
Right, because we're not finalizing our amendments now. So I guess the trick is for, you know, the people that have national association that are working on this to reach out to them and find out, like medicine, you know, countrywide, what are other jurisdictions doing with this?
But yes, sir, question, actually 2 points to follow up on.
Say it, Kevin, is
That's
that,
Captain Quinlan, yeah,
thank you.
yeah, new here from Chicago, but we have an engineering headquarters in Chicago, and this topic has come up, obviously on the cost concern side. One thing that wasn't addressed is detection, possibility of detecting a leak. Not to add cost, but simple detection, perhaps pressure sensor in the circuit that could alert the building, first alert. Or alternatively in the shaft, perhaps detections on new buildings. That could be a cost reduction strategy. It could also increase cost, depending on the situation. Also, just to follow up on R410A in terms of its elimination, 2029 is supposed to be 70% supposed to be eliminated, 80% by 34, and then out by 36. Just follow up on those two.
So at this point, I tend to agree that we're not going to get an answer to this. And luckily, Ashbury is a living document, so they are continually providing updates. And it is something that is happening throughout the US, that is going to hopefully be addressed. And again, my biggest concern is existing buildings.
Okay.
I think so, but I don't have an answer.
Yeah, the good news is we're paying attention.
Yeah.
And this is not just us. So I would say, let's continue to reach out to the national organizations that have got to be working on this. Right. And let's see what's coming up. And we don't have to have an answer today or next month, but it is around the corner shortly. So it would be nice to start gathering that information. But anything else on the IMC? Okay, well, good. Great discussions. Thank you. Let's move on to item 3, the IBC chapters 1 through 8. Anybody come up with any items for discussion today? Besides just figuring out how those changing definitions affect us in other chapters, which is
A ton of new definitions.
right. That's the biggest.
So the ramifications are unclear at this point,
Well,
until you get into the meat of the code.
in the chapters where it starts affecting other things. Do we have anything?
This is like, I heard in the previous meeting, possible concern about the definition change of use, because it now includes the word accessibility. So we did a little bit of background on that to provide a response to the committee. The greater degree of accessibility, which is really what this code section is calling for. If there's a change of use that includes a greater level of fire safety, or in this case, accessibility, then a new certificate of occupancy would be required. The question was, well, what does that mean? What does a greater level of accessibility mean in a change of use? two examples. One would be a care facility that's changing from condition 1 to condition 2. For ambulatory clients. Condition 1 is essentially that the people being cared for can respond to an emergency on their own. Condition 2 is they need some limited verbal assistance to exit that building. That could be considered an increase of accessibility. Another example would be a fee occupancy of business changing from something that does not have a great public access component, such as say a radio station, for example. A radio station is considered a fee occupancy, but they don't have a tremendous amount of public coming and going. A barber shop is also a fee occupancy, but they make their business by people coming and going. So just the sheer nature of the public, having greater access to the facility, that change of use, even though it's staying within a fee occupancy, could also be considered an increase in accessibility criteria. So wanted to throw that out and see if there were any other additional questions related to that.
So based on what you're saying, it sounds like that accessibility would apply to the exiting requirements, not necessarily all the accessibility requirements.
If there is an increased level of accessibility needs in the building, it could be considered a change of use, right? So really what we're talking about is when would a building need a new certificate of occupancy, or more specifically, a new plan review and new inspections to ensure that they comply with the current regulations. And that the answer is when the volume or intensity increases.
Okay, that I get. But the problem with existing buildings and accessibility is the scope of what's required on that building. Once you figure out the scope, then it's pretty cut and dried. But identifying the scope, particularly on an existing building, can get kind of sticky. So I'm saying if this is because of the change of use, that the exits need to be more accessible, would the accessibility requirements apply just to the exits? And make sure you
That
have
would
it.
be a determination based on the plan review or the building official to determine the impact of the increased accessibility. And then the 20% rule would also apply for the amount invested in upgrades and how much has to be, or I believe it's actually no more than 20% would be required for accessible upgrades on an existing building.
Even with the change of occupancy,
Yes,
the 20% would still apply on a change of occupancy.
to the extent that the language affords that 20% to apply.
Yeah, I mean, as an architect trying to design that, figuring out the scope of these accessibility requirements is the hardest part. Once the scope's established, then, going through and meeting the handicap requirements are fairly easy, but the scope is always a big issue, particularly on existing buildings. What do you do for a second, third? What's included in this?
My concern would be, this is Brett, my concern would be take an existing building, increase the accessibility, are you gonna require a second elevator?
Second elevator,
Because you're increasing the number of people that are in that building requiring, for exits, and for maybe, or an exterior, another set of exit stairs on the outside or something. Like Rick was saying, the scope, how much is this gonna add by changing that? And who's, like you said, who's gonna determine, you said the building official is gonna determine, what additional work is gonna be required to upgrade the accessibility.
the reason I say that that's a discretionary decision on the planning neighbor and the building official is because there's any number of ways to meet the code. So it's not a recipe as it were, where these are always going to be required. There's a tremendous amount of leeway on the designer's ability to meet that 20% by increasing door widths or providing a ramp. And that's a design decision. It's not necessarily a code person.
Yeah,
Prescriptive code requirement.
once the scope is established, you're right, it's a design decision. The biggest problem with existing buildings is defining what the scope is. Once you get that defined, you can have alternatives for handicap accessibility, but you need to first establish what the scope is before you can do the design for accessibility.
That would be different for each building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're saying that we have to go and have a negotiation on what the scope is before we start to design.
That's not what I said.
Okay. You're
I'm
saying,
saying that it's a design decision to establish what would be included in the scope of a project seeking a building permit, and that the plan reviewer and the building official would determine whether or not the proposal meets the intent of the code. But I don't see this definition change as, widely requiring that new elevators are going to be installed or any of that nature. It's a clarification. This definition is specifically a clarification that an increase in accessibility requirements would fall under the criteria of a change of use, which would be consistent with any other section of the code. If you have more people in the building because the use is changing, it would be a change of use. If the life hazard risk associated with the building use is increasing, then it's a change of use. What we're trying to establish here is when a new review would be required, not to create new requirements to be applied.
issue is always the scope. Once you figure out the scope, then it's relatively simple. Applies to these things, and you have alternatives to make these come into compliance.
Right, so just going back to the definition, in fact, let's just go ahead and read that definition for the benefit of the folks in the audience who may be listening in. Change of use, section 202. Change of occupancy, excuse me. Either of the following shall be considered as a change of occupancy where this code requires a greater degree of safety, accessibility, structural strength, fire protection, means of egress, ventilation, or sanitation than is existing in the current building or structure. And then we went from 3 items listed to only 2, but it is specifically states that where the code requires a greater degree of safety or accessibility, it could be considered a change of use. Change of occupancy, excuse me. Thank you.
From my perspective, going into an existing building and figuring out what the scope is for accessibility is the biggest problem. Because I may go and say, well, this needs to be accessible. And Brewer may look at it and say, no, this over here has to be accessible also. And it's a problem now. This doesn't fix it, makes it worse.
I don't see that it makes it worse, personally. It just simply defines that an increase in degree of accessibility could be considered a change of occupancy.
Okay,
But I'd still go back to, what would require upgrades, accessible upgrades, whether you're talking about the hallway or the bathroom or the exit or the ramp leading up to the building. Those are design options that are available to the applicant. the code is not specific that it requires, all of those items. There is a laundry list in that section that's, refers to the 20% exception.
Okay, well, so we
won't beat this horse.
I don't think we're gonna get it solved today, but it is something that we should all be watching, or how these definitions are found under parts of the code. Because anytime you change a definition, then it often causes things to kick in later.
Well, particularly when you get into the weeds, into the code, you're always going back to the definition.
Right.
Which is key to implementation of certain sections. So,
Anything else on the IBC chapter 23? Okay. I guess, and it's call the audience. Is there anything that members don't like?
Sorry, I did have one other item I wanted to bring up about the IBC.
Okay.
As it relates to coordination with the IFC. The Fire Code Committee for the City of Tucson has approved the proposed fire code amendments already. We are in discussion with the fire department about when those might be adopted and or applied. We're attempting to make them consistent, so all the codes are applicable at the same time. We don't have, the 24 IFC out in front of the other regulations, but that's some.
weren't they gonna adopt those in July?
But the effective date may not be until January. So that's part of the discussion, right? Because if they've already done the work and reviewed the new code, then adoption can proceed even if the effective date is 6 months later. But one major change that I think also affects previous conversations in this committee is the quantity of clients allowed in care facilities. Because we've had conflicting information between the building code, the fire code, the state code, the zoning codes, as it relates to how many people can be cared for in different care type facilities. The building code has a threshold of 16. The fire code, the previous fire code amendments amended that number down to 10, which is consistent with the state Arizona Revised Statute 36-401. But the committee for the fire code approved omitting that change and that reduction from 16 to 10.
If you got 12,
Building.
what category? But you have 12 occupants.
It depends on which code you're looking at, okay? Because the city of Tucson zoning code has a threshold at 10
Wow.
and at 15, and the state of Arizona has a threshold at 10. So it would be consistent for the IBC to also have the threshold at 10, although it's stated as.
Yeah, I would ignore what zoning requires. But you can have unlimited, or depends on the zoning and the impact on the neighborhood. It's not a life safety issue. And I think looking at the zoning code limitations confuses it. So I would just ignore what the zoning code. It's on a specific lot, you can only have 10. On another lot, it may be unlimited. Has to do with the zoning, et cetera, et cetera. So I think bringing in the zoning code kind of confuses this demarcation.
Okay.
It seems like the issue is between the building code and the state licensing code.
I absolutely agree. The state licensure is the lowest denominator at this point, right? And so if we don't change the building code occupant limits to match what the state licensure says, then there's the potential for the city to issue a permit that allows up to 16, but the state issues a license that's limited to 10. And so there's this potential for confusion as it relates to how many that facility could serve.
Well, let me ask you a stupid question. Why do you care? I mean, you're basing the number at 16 because of the analysis that the code people have done.
The code specifies 16.
If somebody comes to me, I should know what the building code requirement is, and I should know what the state requirement is. Should that be something for the designer to sort out? Not for the city to match the state?
I think that's a fair approach. However, we also want to set our applicants up for success, and not every applicant includes a design professional.
How can you do that occupancy without a license?
The city of Tucson does allow permits to be issued without a design professional in some cases. So we want to be consistent, okay? But again, it's the pleasure of the committee on whether or not that code section related to the maximum number of occupants per care facility should match the state or should just remain as published.
With all due respect, I don't know why the city's taking that on. It's very complicated. All these various code requirements, and not to have a design professional. I know people don't want to spend the money for the fees, but it's a complicated code analysis, big headache to sort through that. And it's not for the uninitiated. Stuff has gotten approved that shouldn't.
So we have a scenario where our previous IBC amendments reduced the maximum quantity from 16 to 10. And that was omitted in our last cycle. So our 2018 amendments do not have that restriction, but that was new to the last code cycle. The next development in this conversation is the fire department has now also eliminated that reduction from 16 to 10. Okay, so really updating the committee to let you know that now the fire code is consistent with the previously adopted building code where there's no change. The 16 still stands.
Which is good. So then you can rely on the building code for those numbers. As opposed to checking the building code, fire code and state.
Correct. So at this point, there is no amendment proposed to reduce. That potential is available to you if you seek to align with the state criteria, but the amendment is not there. We eliminated it last cycle, and now the fire code is eliminated in this cycle.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, Rob?
Did TFD go through a public process on the ISD code numbers?
I can't speak to the fire codes process. I'm sorry. Not involved.
I'm sorry, so
I was not involved in the fire code committee process.
I just want to jump back to the occupancy, change of use. You had a couple scenarios. Let's pretend you had a Los Betos, local, small restaurant. Then you had a Chipotle coming in national, but you would assume the business is going to rise. Same use, same occupancy. Would it be a determination of the plan reviewer and the building official to say, no, I think there's going to be more people at the Chipotle. You're going to have to increase your hallways. You're going to have to add some 88 parking stalls. Is that what I heard, Rick, on some of your concerns? This scenario?
No, it's still the same use and occupancy.
Same use,
And
but
it's
it's
got-
got to be more intense.
Well, that's the
Based
problem,
on-
that's the problem with restaurants. They give you a square foot number.
It sure do.
It doesn't matter whether it's a very successful restaurant or a very poorly run restaurant. It's calculated the same.
Like I hear you say, it's at the discretion of the reviewer and the building official if that use is more intense.
That
I
is the
heard
way
you say that.
that is the way the code is currently written. I will say that is widely applied in plan review today. In that if a restaurant is going from 80 occupants to 130 occupants based on their seating schedule, that could kick in the requirement for fire sprinklers. Because the limit is 100 occupants without fire sprinklers.
Totally get that, with regards to tables and the size of the dining room, but can it be rationalized by a reviewer that this is gonna be, you got the same amount of tables, you're gonna, can that be rationalized?
The occupant load is based on the occupant areas,
Totally get that.
not the business name or the business model. So going from Las Vegas to Chipotle, would not increase the occupant load, but increasing the number of tables or the dining area would, for sure.
Dan?
I was just gonna point out that the change of occupancy definition in the international existing building code is a little bit different than it is in the United States. But item number 2 says a change in the purpose or a change in the level of activity within a building structure.
Well, I mean, but that increase in level activity has to be based on the criteria of the code, not a plan reviewer's personal opinion, right?
Right.
Or anything else? Right.
I want to object to the QR for this.
So we can please establish an agenda for the next meeting where what code sections are we going to be reviewing?
Now, the comparison work that was done by the city of county, beyond chapter 8, what's that?
It's almost complete. We'll have, it ready within the next few weeks, with advance notice so that you have time to review it for the next meeting. The outstanding codes that we still have, just as a recap of, the codes we still need to cover, the IRC, which hasn't been fully released, the IPCC, which hasn't been fully released. But the swimming pool and spa code and the existing building code are still outstanding. So those are two that you could add into the next agenda.
Okay.
And get it into the second half of the IBC, which would be chapter 9 through 33.
We got NEC.
In the which?
NEC.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I think we should probably start getting those listed and at least start looking at them. I mean, it is May next month, June. So the year is almost half over. So, yeah, let's get any of those that are available, because obviously we have some issues with availability. But stuff that's available, let's get it on the agenda to start reviewing.
So, did I understand you correctly that the next agenda should include the swimming pool and spa code, the existing building code, and the national electric code?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, if they're
Well,
available.
we haven't even got to the building code. Yeah, we've got chapters 9 through.
Right.
33.
We've got a couple more meetings just for the building code.
Right.
Is that the next meeting or are you gonna jump ahead to these others?
Well, I think the next meeting, we should start reviewing chapters 9 through 33, because there's other supporting codes that are ready for us to start reviewing. There's no reason.
Like I said, put them all on the agenda, but we may not make it all the way through the agenda.
Right.
Okay.
Right, start the discussion below. Right, because the IRC and the existing building code, when they become available, there's gonna be a lot there to talk about.
You
So
know,
anything we can get behind this, let's get moving on it.
well, I got a question for the city and county. You have the home inclusive ordinance,
Inclusive home.
inclusive home ordinance. Well, the ANSI standard now has a requirement for single family. Have this been in consideration of using that instead of the current code? That's why I'm asking the question, yeah. I mean, it'd be more consistent
Yeah,
to fall back to the national standard.
no, I agree. I guess. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you. Have to compare it. I haven't done a comparison. I'd have to search. I would think if it was similar to what the inclusive home design, why aren't you probably? But I would have to.
Yeah, well, the city and county kind of ahead of the curve on this single family residential accessibility. But now we have a national standard. I think we need to take a look at that.
Yeah.
So from the city perspective, we have an ordinance that was adopted by mayor and council that, you know, creates an effectiveness of the inclusive home design ordinance that specifies specific sections of the ANSI A-117 that applies. So we have an ordinance that is adopted by mayor and council. That ordinance calls out specific sections in the ANSI A-117. So in order to use a different or newer standard, we would have to make sure that the adopted ordinance still is met with those sections. Or we would have to revise the ordinance as adopted by mayor and council. Because the ordinance specifically calls out specific sections of the ANSI A-117.
That's the same.
Right.
Basically.
So, I mean, well, what I'm asking is to take a look at the ordinance, take a look at the appendix. And just adopt the appendix and get rid of the ordinances.
Yeah,
I mean, if it's,
we
Close enough.
will take a look at it, from the city perspective, to make sure that the ordinance itself doesn't have to go back through a mayor and council adoption process, or if it does, we'll explain that.
We're ready to adjourn. Somebody want to make a motion?
so,
Second. Any discussion? Those in favor? Those opposed? Date the next week. What's our regular date?
We'll be meeting, every second Tuesday of the month, the next meeting date,
But
June 11th.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.